So welcome everybody to the My IVF Answers platform, which is part of the European Fertility Society, which is dedicated to supporting and raising awareness and educating patients who are facing infertility challenges. EFS's core mission is to guide and assist patients in making one of the most significant decisions of their lives, choosing the right fertility treatments and solutions, as well as asking questions live. Today, our speaker is Ansley Newson, and she's Professor of Bioethics at the University of Sydney, Australia. But has just told me actually that she was in the UK for a little while. And over her 25-year career in bioethics, she's developed a body of work that critically considers how reproductive and genomic technologies should be used while in research, clinical and population health settings. Ansley has had an interest in mitochondrial donation since similar techniques emerged in the early 2000s. She's published on a technique from bioethical and empirical perspectives, the latter using community-jury methods. Ansley also has participated in public debate on mitochondrial donation in Australia, the United Kingdom and Singapore. In 2018, she appeared in front of an Australian Senate inquiry on mitochondrial donation. She was also a member of the Mitochondrial Donation Expert Working Committee for the Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council from 2018 to 2020. Ansley has 2 children, one conceived following ovulation induction. So today we're continuing with the program on all mitochondrial replacement therapies, and this kind of specific title for today is Ethical Considerations in Mitochondrial Donation. Just to remind everybody that this session is recorded, and any questions are anonymous, and the recording of the presentation and the Q&A will be available on the YouTube channel tomorrow. So I'll just pass over you to now, Ansley, so that you can just start your presentation.
Sure, thank you so much, and thanks for reading out that very long biography, which I didn't realise was going to be read verbatim. It's lovely to be here, and thanks everyone for attending or watching after the fact. I will share my screen. Okay, can you see the presentation? Can you see that, Valerie? Looks good?
Yep, that's fine.
Yep,
thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so as Valerie said, I'm here to talk to you today about ethical considerations in mitochondrial donation. The speaker for the most recent seminar in this series was also from Australia. So if you've watched that recording or attended that one, you'll know that it is customary in Australia to do something called acknowledge country as a non-Indigenous person. And so I will just do that now. I am speaking to you tonight today in my time from Australia, from Sydney, and I am on unceded Aboriginal land, and that land is the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. And so I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including elders past and present. And a big aspect of Indigenous cultures globally and in Australia too is around sharing knowledge and sharing stories. And so I just want to acknowledge that the tens of thousands of years of knowledge sharing and curation that have gone on with Indigenous cultures. Okay, it is also customary often to start a presentation with a conflict of interest statement. So in the interests of full transparency, I'll just do that too, although Valerie has covered a lot of this in the biography that she read out as well. So I don't have any commercial conflicts of interest to declare. I'm an academic in a university. I just get my normal salary, but I have been an investigator on a grant that undertook an examination of ethical, legal and social issues in mitochondrial genomics and considered mitochondrial donation as part of that. And as Valerie mentioned, I was a member of a couple of committees as well, including one that made some recommendations to government about the legalisation of mitochondrial donation in Australia. I also want to clarify the scope of the presentation because there's been a little bit of variability in this series so far. So I'm an academic bioethicist, and my work on mitochondrial donation has come from the perspective of considering this reproductive technology as an intervention to prevent the birth of children with mitochondrial disease. And so that is what my presentation is going to focus on today. So I'm not going to be talking about the use of this technique as a way of ideally in boosting fertility rates or other uses. And this is for a couple of reasons. The first one is that where mitochondrial donation is specifically regulated, that particular use as a fertility add-on is out of scope, and it is not recommended at this point in time by bodies such as the European Society for Human Reproduction and Embryology, or ESHRE. And the image I've got on the slide there with the yellow highlights is a fairly recent document, a really big document that ESHRE produced as good practice recommendations for a whole lot of add-ons in IVF, including mitochondrial replacement therapy, which, as I'll go on to describe, is another name for mitochondrial donation. But they say it should only be done in a really tightly controlled research protocol, and at this point in time, the evidence is not there for its use as a fertility add-on. Okay, so I've got 3 things that I'm going to do in my presentation tonight or today. The first 2 are more scene setting, and the third one is the substantial part of my presentation. I'll start just by describing a little bit about the field that I work in of bioethics, and then, just in case this is the first of this seminar series that you've come to, just thought I'd provide a little bit by way of orientation to what mitochondria are and what they do, and what mitochondrial disease is. And then I'll go on to talk about the ethical implications in mitochondrial donation. So first, a little bit about bioethics. So we are a field of inquiry. We're interdisciplinary, so we use the word field rather than discipline, and we look at values and moral issues that happen in healthcare, research, population health. And we offer a way of thinking through difficult issues where there might be likely to be a conflict or a concern, where questions like should or must or ought come up. And we answer those types of questions using ethical reasoning and ethical argumentation. And so we try to justify what should happen in a particular situation and on what grounds. And we advance what is called an ethical argument. And this is not shouting at people, it's a position which we defend with reasoning. So just to summarise, we try to ask and answer critical questions about health, research and population health, and we do that through advancing and defending particular positions and critically engaging with the positions that others make too. We use a couple of methods in our field. One is called empirical bioethics, and that's kind of looking at what is, like what is going on, what's happening in a field, what do people think, and this obtains descriptive information, facts and evidence. And usually you can sort of show that this is true or untrue using, ways of interrogating the quality of that research from a methodological perspective. And one example actually of the is for me is the work that Valerie mentioned at the start, doing so-called citizens' juries to look at public opinion on mitochondrial donation. I haven't included a lot about that research in this presentation, but I'm really happy to answer questions about it. The other way that we undertake research in bioethics is the ought or the normative, and this is value-laden. We try to get to the heart of the issues from an ethical and moral perspective, and we generate prescriptive, as in this is good, we should do this, or proscriptive, this is not good, we should not do that, kind of statements, and we defend those by looking at key concepts, key moral theories, and engaging with scholarship of others in the field. And we evaluate that, as I've mentioned already, using arguments. So that's just very, very briefly what my field is about. Now, just another way of scene setting is to provide a little bit of information about mitochondria. So you may know about these already, but mitochondria are the so-called energy powerhouse of a cell. They are what's called an organelle or a mini organ within our cells. They have their own DNA separate to our nucleus. So you might think about our nucleus. You probably know that we have chromosomes within our cells, but there is also DNA in mitochondria, and it's arranged into 37 genes. And there can be up to thousands and thousands of mitochondria in most of our cells, not all of them, but there can be a few or a lot, but they're really importantly doing functions like energy generation. And a really interesting aspect of mitochondria is that they don't appear generally, or they do appear in very small numbers in sperm, and they're mainly in oocytes or eggs. And so as a result of that, they are only really passed down from mothers to their children, not by male reproductive partners. And so they have a lot of really important roles in how our bodies work. And so the technology of mitochondrial donation only pertains to problems with mitochondria that exist in mitochondrial DNA. And I'll explain a little bit more about that now. So mitochondrial donation, as I mentioned when I was describing the scope of my talk, is designed initially to help people who have mitochondrial disease themselves to avoid transmitting this to their children. Mitochondrial disease is a slogan that the Australian Mito Foundation use is any symptom in any organ at any age. So it's a really diverse range of conditions, and this can make it tricky to diagnose. I talked to you about mitochondria on the previous slide, but mitochondrial disease can be caused by either mutations in mitochondria or mutations in our nuclear DNA. So we can just set aside nuclear DNA mutations for mitochondria or gene changes that cause disease for the moment, because mitochondrial donation technology is set up only for mutations in mitochondria, because there's other things we can think about if a mutation is in the nucleus. I've mentioned that there are probably a lot of people walking around on this planet who have mitochondrial disease and don't know it, either because their health professional hasn't thought about mitochondrial donation, or because they're actually not sick enough to warrant diagnosis at this point in time. But it is quite a complex thing, and there's as well as developing treatments for mitochondrial disease, experts are attempting to actually help increase diagnosis rates as well. I mentioned earlier that there's a couple of different names for mitochondrial donation, and actually in our field, bioethics, there's debate over what it should be called as well, because different names might bring with them different imagery or different meanings. But all I want to say is that if you see on a website or in your research that there are different terms, I just want you to recognise that effectively the technology being discussed is the same. So on this slide, I have mitochondrial replacement therapy, mitochondrial replacement techniques, mitochondrial replacement, mitochondrial donation, human nuclear genome transfer, which is what some bioethicists have called it, and a term you might have seen in the media more than anywhere else is three-parent babies. I'm going to use the term mitochondrial donation, but these others are often used interchangeably as well. Okay, so let's get down now into the ethical considerations in mitochondrial donation. I've got a few to go through. So, and these are, what I should say is I've deliberately set this presentation up to try and be neutral, in the sense that I want to present the issues for you to think about. And so what I'm trying to do is to encapsulate a lot of the bioethics debate that has happened, and to try and show you the contours of the types of scholarship that have happened in the field of mitochondrial genomics and mitochondrial donation. So the first issue I want to talk to you about is whether mitochondrial donation is a so-called want or a so-called need. And this is something that is sometimes used as a way of distinguishing maybe something that's a moral imperative or a need, or something that's actually maybe morally permissible but not a moral imperative, so a want, for example. And this really boils down to the key reason why mitochondrial donation was developed, which is the very natural and understandable desire that most humans have, if they want to have children and can have them, to have children that are genetically related to them. And of course, we have other options available as well when those options aren't available, but none of those are straightforward. So mitochondrial donation came about as a way to help people who are at risk of passing on mitochondrial disease, usually they have to have oocytes or eggs. They may not necessarily be people that identify as women, but this allows a child who ideally is free of mitochondrial disease but retains a genetic relationship through nuclear DNA with both parents. And there are other ways that you can have a child without mito, as in mitochondrial disease, but that involves egg donation, so that genetic relationship would be lost, or adoption, where there wouldn't be a genetic relationship with either parent. But I do want to acknowledge that those technologies are not straightforward either, or those interventions are not straightforward either. And so it's really hard. We want to be able to offer people at risk of transmitting mitochondrial disease the option to have a child if they wish to, but at the same time, it's always going to be challenging choices when their form of mitochondrial disease is inherited through their mitochondria. There is also debate in my field about why genetic relatedness is ethically important, and not everybody in my field endorses that genetic relatedness is important. And so the question that I'll ask you is, well, does this possibility of having a genetically related child justify the use of a reproductive technology, that is mitochondrial donation, when its long-term safety has yet to be proven? And I'll go on to safety now. So it is not yet possible to guarantee that the safety of mitochondrial donation is proven. And because we just haven't had enough children born with it over the years. So the question is, how safe is safe enough? And who gets to decide this? So in the field, it could be an argument that experts should decide this, or actually, if there's a safety threshold met, should the argument be that parents should decide this instead? And ultimately, we need to take care and try and manage some of the significant hope that surrounds this technology, and ensure that we accurately represent to parents that it is still a technology that doesn't have a lot of long-term data around it. And we need to make sure that we don't overhype the technology. Another attribute of this technology is that it is, because we are changing the total complement of genetic material in a cell, it's not a technology that makes changes at the level of DNA, but we are taking out certain mitochondria, those that pose the risk of mitochondrial disease, and putting in some mitochondria from a donor oocyte, or actually you're using the donor oocyte as a shell. And the change to that composition of the genome of the person who's born as a result of this technology could then be passed to their children as well, if they're female, because of the inheritance from mothers to their children that I mentioned earlier. And so experts tend to argue that this is a form of germline gene therapy, and that this is not something, germline gene therapy generally is not something that we usually condone because of grounds like its uncertainty, its safety considerations, and the inability of people to consent. That is, those who are born being unable to consent. If there is a harm as a result of this technology, you want to try and ensure that that harm is not then transmitted down through generations. And there's been a bit of debate in the field of mitochondrial donation about how that might be secured. But how should this potential heritability of the changes to the genome that are made factor into the debate? And there are some conflicting claims here. Some say that mitochondrial DNA is not very significant. It's just like swapping out a battery for something, a new battery that works a bit better. And also the numbers of children that are going to be born as a result of this technology, at least in the early years, is very small. And so any impact of any potential harm is going to be small. There's no sort of genetic engineering going on in that typical way that we might think about it. So we just need to think here about the significance of potential passing on and what that might mean and how that should factor into the debate. Another issue that has been very prevalent in the debate, particularly in Australia, is whether oocyte or egg donors for mitochondrial donation should be anonymous. Australia is one of the first countries globally to remove donor anonymity generally in other forms of gamete donation, and we've even done that retrospectively in some states of Australia. And for mitochondrial donation in the debate in some countries globally, there were arguments that because it was just mitochondria, that is only 37 genes per mitochondria, actually a responsibility for energy generation, that it's not the same as standard egg donation, and that as a result, it could be anonymous. That was some of the debate that was made. In Australia, the direction that the debate took was to recognise the significance of the donation. It's significant for the donor, the process that they go through is exactly the same as for standard egg donation. And for the child, it has an absolutely massive impact, because if it works as intended, it would make the difference between whether a person is born and will go on to develop mitochondrial disease or not. And so that, combined with the growing global recognition of a right of a child to know their genetic origins, meant that in Australia a decision was made to build in non-anonymity, as in identifiability, into the donation process. And the safeguards that are in place in our regulation, which is currently a clinical trial, enable the child to find this information out as they grow older. Another debate that you might see in lots of forms of intervening to prevent the birth of a child with a genetic condition is that of disability rights, and whether the existence of mitochondrial donation actually devalues the lives, sorry, there's a word missing on my slide there, devalues the lives of those with mitochondrial disease, or does it mean that the lives of those with mitochondrial disease are of less value because we're trying to avoid having a child who will go on to develop that? And so we need to think here carefully about the impact that a choice to have a child free of mitochondrial disease might have on those living with the condition. For mitochondrial disease, there is wide agreement that these are serious genetic conditions, and that includes among people living with mitochondrial disease. Those individuals are some of the key people who advocated for the legalisation of mitochondrial donation, first in the United Kingdom and then in Australia. And so I think here the key thing to do is to look to the experience and attitudes of people who've experienced mitochondrial disease, and to let their lived experience guide development in the field. Another point I think that is relevant here is to say that providing support for people who live with the condition can still be maintained, and respect and avoidance of stigma and discrimination is still incredibly important. That's not the same as a family choosing, with careful counselling in place, to avoid the birth of a child with mitochondrial donation. Another aspect of the debate is surrounding equity and value for money. And I've got a little cartoon on the slide here to illustrate the difference between equality and equity. And you can see under equality, everyone gets the same. And under equity, sometimes we might need to give those who have some form of disadvantage more support. So in the debates over mitochondrial donation, there was some discussion in the early days about the potential cost of this technology and whether it was justified to have that expense in comparison to other needs in the healthcare system. It is an expensive technology, as most assisted reproductive technologies are. But on the other hand, there will be small numbers of people who will be accessing it, in the early days at least. And for those who do access it, the impact could be incredibly positive if it works as intended. And as a result, also, it could save other costs in the future. So families who have children with mitochondrial disease, or families that are caring for adults with mitochondrial disease, they take time off work, so they lose income. There are, depending on where you live, there could be medical bills. And so actually those costs can be traded off and compared with each other. And there is also an equity consideration related to what I mentioned earlier around the estimates that actually mitochondrial donation is quite underdiagnosed in the population at the moment. And so we need to think about that too. And actually the mere existence of mitochondrial donation and the public debate that happened around it is quite interesting because it means that being able to access this technology, or the debate over whether it should become available, is quite interesting in the sense that it actually raised awareness of mitochondrial disease more generally. In a country like Australia too, it's also really important to think about access in just a geographic way. We're a very dispersed population. About 80% of Australian population lives on the east coast of Australia, and we have a lot of people who live rurally and remotely. And the type of specialist care that's going to be required for accessing mitochondrial donation is going to involve travel for those people, and therefore loss of income, etc. too. So we need to think about those considerations when we're setting up future clinical care to help people at risk of passing on mitochondrial disease access mitochondrial donation in due course. As I mentioned, it's still under a research protocol in Australia. This is one slide where I will just quickly mention some of the research we did. We ran a series of citizens' juries in Australia last year to ask ordinary members of the public what they felt about public funding for mitochondrial donation. And all three juries that we ran supported public funding for mitochondrial donation, with a few conditions. They felt that it was good value for money to offer it. It was fair to publicly fund it as opposed to only allow those who could afford it to pay for it, and that also it would allow for more scientific innovation. However, they wanted external review of the costs and to prove that it was cost effective. They didn't want people to undergo unlimited cycles of mitochondrial donation. And they also wanted other pathways to parenthood, such as those that I mentioned earlier, egg donation and adoption, to also be better funded and better promoted as well. So I'm coming to the final couple of ethical considerations now. One of these is what life might be like for a child who's born following mitochondrial donation. Now, we know there have been between 1 and 4 babies born in the United Kingdom as a result of this technology. The professionals involved and the regulator involved has been deliberately vague about that in order to take every measure to protect the privacy of the child and their family. But one thing we do know is that children born as a result of this technology, at least in the early years, are going to be, the early years of the technology, it's going to be quite a long time for the person born. They're going to be subject to follow-up, in the sense that we need to undertake some additional checks in those children to ensure that the technology has worked as intended, that they're not developing mitochondrial disease, and that there are no other untoward effects. And if their identity ever becomes known, there's also likely to be significant media interest in that child and their family. And so from an ethical perspective, it's important to ask, well, what will that be like for the families and the children? How should the children be told about their origins? And how should the interests of these children be protected? And so I think it's really important to recognise, obviously how a person is born is an important part of identity, but it's also just one part of who they are as a person. And so we have seen this a little bit with the history of IVF more generally, but, we now live in a world that is just always connected. And I think there would be a lot more scrutiny than there might have been in the early days of IVF, for example. So we just need to take measures to really protect the well-being of the children born as a result of this technology. So just by way of final considerations, mitochondrial donation to prevent mitochondrial disease offers an additional reproductive option for those who have a high chance of transmitting mitochondrial disease due to mutations in their mitochondrial DNA. And in Australia and the United Kingdom, where in various ways the technology has been legalised, the debate for us has moved on from whether to allow it, because we have, albeit under a research protocol at the moment, and then very strict conditions in any potential move to clinical practice in the future. So the question for us now is how. And so there's a lot of regulation around consent and counselling because we don't have any long-term data yet, and that's addressed in safety considerations. A choice whether or not to use mitochondrial donation, and we want to make sure that if someone is choosing to use it, they're doing so with no pressure. We want to follow up over time, but we need to make sure that everybody's comfortable with that and that the children's childhood is protected. And from an equity perspective, we need to make sure that it's available to any family at risk of passing on mitochondrial disease to see if they wish to use it. And we also need to make sure that we're doing so with appropriate consideration for safety. So that is all that I wanted to mention about ethical considerations for mitochondrial disease. Thank you so much for listening. That QR code on the slide there just takes you to my Google Scholar profile, which lists all the papers I've ever published, including some on mitochondrial donation. Thank you. I will now work out how to not share my screen. I think I've done it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And thank you, Ansley. I mean, that was really clear information. I think allow people to access those ethical considerations, even if you had no understanding of what mitochondrial donation was before you kind of came to this talk. So, you know, really great. So thank you. I've got a couple of questions, actually, if I could just ask you. You kind of said that you weren't going to refer to the 3-parent baby thing. So really, you know, obviously that is misleading. And just to say, you know, it's about 0.1% of our DNA is the mitochondria. It makes us. So where do you think this kind of sensationalized 3-parent baby has come from, and do you think it will stick?
I think it came from probably early media reports, in the sense that a person without really detailed knowledge of the technology, but nevertheless keen to talk about it with the public, which is really important, maybe just looked at how many genetic contributions there are to a child. And strictly speaking, a child born of mitochondrial donation has a genetic parent who provided a sperm, a genetic parent who provided a nucleus from an oocyte or an egg, and a genetic parent who provided the mitochondria in the egg. And so, you know, you count them, there's 3. But I think the distinction is the term 3-parent. Like, parenting is a social role.
Mm-hmm.
And many people have lots of parents. If you're from a separated family where your parents have repartnered, you could have 4 parents. If you are born and your parents are a same-sex couple, you probably have your social parents and a donor. You know, there's lots and lots of ways that we have different parents in our life, but also we often have more than 2 genomes in our body as well. If you've received an organ from someone or had a bone marrow transplant, you've got someone else's DNA in you. If you get an infection, you have DNA that's not yours in your body. You know, there's so many different ways to think about it. So it's not like there's going to be 3 people in your household
Mm-hmm.
making your school lunches and telling you what to do. And even if there is, that's fine, because that's how lots of families work anyway. So I think, you know, the imagery, it does kind of represent that there is another kind of very, very important entity involved in the birth of the child. And actually that DNA, even though it's very small in the sense of 37 genes, it makes the difference between whether someone has mitochondrial disease or not. So it's small, but incredibly significant. And so while I think the analogy was kind of designed to elicit a response, what our job as ethicists is to actually unpack that and to ask what's going on conceptually here. Why are we using those words? What response are we trying to get from using those words? And actually, is the meaning that they're conveying actually an effective way to think about the debate? And so I completely agree with you that it's a bit of a sensationalist term. It has a bit of imagery associated with it, but actually I think it's much more useful to think about some of the other issues that I discussed in my presentation.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, I mean, you could almost say like it's 2.002 people genome baby. I mean, you know, that would be better, but obviously isn't going to happen. Okay, thank you.
And some of the scientists I collaborate with do use that to try and counter that narrative.
Well, that's good, because I'm a scientist, so it makes me feel better. Thank you. So just as well, wanted to just go back to the safety threshold that you mentioned. looking, because there are kind of so few cases, especially where it's regulated at the moment, and the oldest IVF baby is 46, so there's lots of kind of children being born from embryo biopsy, micromanipulation that haven't, there's been no follow-up. So really there would perhaps be a call for some kind of international collaboration of the follow through and following up. But do you know if anything like that's in the pipeline?
What I do know is that, so in the United Kingdom, there's one centre, as I understand it, that has a license to provide this technology, and they were the centre that actually did most of the research beforehand as well. And then in Australia, it has been enabled for the moment under a research protocol, and there was a competitive grant call, and that grant was awarded to a consortium based out of a university called Monash University, which is in the state of Victoria. But there were several bids, and I think every bid, I knew quite a lot of the bids that were happening, and every single bid that went in actually involved international collaborators in some way. Right. And so the successful bid actually has a team member in common, I think. And so I think there's definitely a lot of global conversations happening, and I think it's in everyone's interests for that to happen. They're keen to share expertise and experience, but also I think it will benefit patients in the longer term, because that data is, or those outcomes are going to be discussed and collaborated upon. And I think, was that what you were asking?
Yeah, it is exactly. And I think where there isn't a regulation, and countries are doing it to improve egg quality, which is again something that was kind of outside the scope of this talk, that there could be information there that's valuable as part of the follow-up as well.
And that's a really tough one, because I think we know it's happening in some places. I think it's happening because of a regulatory gap, not because it's specifically allowed. And I think all we can ask then is, if it does happen, that if you are someone who's thinking about using this technology, that you know that it's not yet recommended by any professional society, and that if you are going into it, you're asking the evidence base that it's being offered on, and you're asking to actually ensure that you're connected with services that will enable follow-up, because it is a pretty big intervention into an embryo, an early embryo, depending on the technique. And so, it's not something to be taken lightly. I think it's a pretty big thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. And we have got a question from Amal, who was attending today, and they've said, please could you provide some more information about identifying donors recipient protocol for mitochondrial donation, and how you would prioritize couples needing the procedure?
So there's kind of two questions in there, Amal. Thank you. The first one is actually, I'm very mindful. Maybe 4 years ago, I could have just sat here and given you the regulation verbatim, but I haven't read it extremely recently, and I don't want to mislead you. I can provide some information after the fact if you want, but in Australia at least, it more or less mirrors the regulation for children born of other forms of gamete donation. And in Australia, we have regulation for the offer of all assisted reproductive technologies that all clinics, whatever they're doing, are required to adhere to. And when mitochondrial donation was legalised in Australia, those guidelines were amended to include a separate chapter about mitochondrial donation, and a clause within that chapter was about how children born of mitochondrial donation can, in due course, access information about their donor. And I believe the UK has taken a slightly different approach. It's more about a voluntary register for mitochondrial donation. I think Australia went further about the identifiability of donors than the UK did. But this could also change with time. So I think that information is all in the public domain about how it's regulated and how people find information. I think, at least in Australia, a decision was taken that it's important that people can know that they were born as a result of this intervention, although, in Australia, the trial has only just started in the last 12 to 18 months. And so there's been no announcement of any children born in Australia yet. So that's a bit of a fudgy answer to your first question. But those regulations do exist. I just don't have them front of mind. The prioritisation of couples, I think that this is a small pool of patients. In Australia, based on UK data that came out of the centre that is licensed to provide this technology, they estimated that around 60 families per year might be interested in using this technology. That in Australia, we have about 300,000 babies born a year. So this is a really small amount of the number of couples who are able to have a child in any given year. And I think for each of those families, there would be a process where they go and have counselling, they find out about the technology. From that, some might decide that actually, I'm really happy that technology exists, but I'm not going to go forward with it for lots of different reasons. Others might choose to go forward. And so I think Australia has set out a number of requirements around severity of the condition and other considerations to work out who is eligible. And I think other than that, it would be a question of capacity and a question of the budget that is provided. So at the moment it's going in Australia, it would be once they get to the stage of actually recruiting, it would be provided under a research protocol. But I think you ask a really good question, because if there are lots of people and there is a capacity issue in the sense that there's actually not enough clinical provision available or there's not enough funding, how do you prioritise and on what ground? And so that's, it's a challenging question, and there's a whole branch of bioethics dedicated to trying to think about that. Some of the things we might think about are who has the best chances of success. That might be one consideration. Who has been waiting the longest? That might be another one. Who is the oldest, or maybe because they've got less time to maybe try and use the technology. These are just guesses, though. I don't know if any of these are actually being used. Another one might be actually just to have, if you've got lots of people that are more or less equivalent, actually to just toss a coin, a lottery. And there is a whole branch of bioethics that kind of argues that that's the best way to decide when you can't reasonably decide on any other ground. But I think it's really important that whatever you do, it's transparent and fair, so that people understand the reasons for any prioritisation that's happening and that they know why they've been put in a particular place in the queue that they have been. But I'd also like to think that while the numbers are small, actually any couple who wants to have a conversation about mitochondrial donation would be able to do so.
Thank you. So I just could kind of fill in a bit, I suppose, for the UK. I think so. In the UK, how it works is that people have to each kind of case has a specific license. So an application to kind of look at the, for example, is there a good chance of it working with regards to ovarian reserve, the severity. So every kind of case is granted, and I think in 2023 April, the last figures we have, there was 32 patients that have been approved. As you said, it is all about the funding, which is NHS based. So there's other criteria like BMI and things like that would come into it. And the anonymity, I think in the UK at the moment, so it does follow similarly in that the mitochondrial donors are registered, but it's only non-identifying information that is given to the recipient at age 16. So they can't actually at the moment get any identifying information at 18, which is different to egg and sperm donors. And that leads us into the question from Hayley. So Hayley said that her Wi-Fi dropped out, but she's really asking the question. She's donor conceived and understands that at the age of 18 that she would be able to access information about her donor. But do we think that could change for the situation in the UK and in Australia? Do you think that could change or be something that's available?
I think in Australia it is actually the same. But what I could do in the background is very quickly look up the regulation. Okay. I don't want to give misleading information. But this was a key point of contention. So when you read my biography, you said that I sat on a committee that helped provide some advice to government. That committee was a really interesting committee because we were tasked to answer several questions by government. And then we deliberated for almost a year and did a really big public consultation. We ran something like a citizen's citizens jury that is like a mini deliberative forum. We flew people in from all over Australia to learn about the technology and let them come up with a statement about how they felt about it. And we also did a more quantitative, like a survey-based analysis as well. And out of that, but also the academics, including me, I should say, I made a submission to the government inquiry before I sat on that committee. And then I appeared in front of that Senate inquiry where I was grilled by politicians about my views. And I advocated in that submission that I made for donation for mitochondrial, egg donation for mitochondrial donation to be treated the same as other forms of egg donation, on the grounds that the process is the same for the donor. And while it is a small complement of the person's DNA who's born, it's a really important complement. And also our knowledge about mitochondria, it actually, I think, is more complex than maybe some of the public debate led us to believe, in the sense that, yes, mitochondria are energy generating mini organs in a cell. But mitochondria, when they have gene changes in them that are problematic, which we call mutations, actually can cause a whole host of different diseases. And so increasingly, as time goes on, they're starting to think about potential role in things like Parkinson's disease, for example. I should really clarify here, I'm not a clinician, and so I don't want to go too far into that. But I think while this information is potentially dynamic, and we know that information can change over time, I think anything we can do to promote transparency is such that we should just treat it as a donation. But also, I think for the person born as a result of the technology, and maybe for the donor too, I can imagine it would be an incredibly powerful thing to be able to contact them and say thank you. So, I'm a bit, I might just get a bit emotional about it, actually. But I think, so for me, I couldn't really see a distinction, and to create a subpopulation among children born of reproductive technology where a donor was involved, even though in a different way. I just felt there was no reason to keep it anonymous. Why? We've moved so much to a culture of open disclosure about so many other things. So yeah, and that is the process that Australia has taken. It is written into our regulation that it is akin to standard oocyte donation.
Okay, which is going to be different to in the UK. So, and I think, but as you said, whether it's 1% or 50%, and knowledge about genetics, perhaps it is very simplistic to think that those genes in the mitochondria operate in a completely isolated way. Yes, and someone's just said thank you. Yeah, they totally agree with the transparency of information. So I have got one more question, actually. I don't think there's any others that have come up. So with the pronuclear transfer, which is where you actually create an embryo and then take those nuclei out and then put in new ones, you actually have kind of created a genetic, it's an embryo that has that capability, and then you stop it. What were the discussions around that with your kind of debate that you had before the licensing started?
Yeah, I had a slide in, actually, that I took out, which was about the status of the embryo, or the moral status of the embryo, because like many forms of assisted reproductive technology, mitochondrial donation does involve embryo destruction and probably embryo discard as well, because of course, once the mitochondrial donation process has happened, then it just kind of turns into like normal IVF. And so there's measures of embryo quality, which Valerie will know much more about than me. And then, you have to choose which embryos to implant, to transfer, with a view to them hopefully implanting. And so I think there was some debate in Australia about the fact that this was a technology that led to embryo destruction. I think, and everybody involved in the debate was attempting to be mindful of that. I guess the comparator that we used was the fact that nothing was raised here that was unique or distinct over and above the other way that we think about embryos in assisted reproduction already. I guess the only thing is, for the bioethics nerds out there, there is I think you could kind of make an argument that actually pronuclear transfer is a kind of form of cloning, although obviously the recipient isn't a clone of the donor at all. But some of the techniques marry up, and there's 1 or 2 papers written about that. But I think ultimately where that debate landed in Australia was, this is things that we do all the time. We are as respectful as we can be to the status of an embryo. We take it seriously. We're not using it in a way that is frivolous. We're doing it for families who have a really debilitating condition and actually want to, if they can, do something to try and avoid it. So, yeah, I think it was handled really sensitively. That said, when there was any call for submissions, so there was a call for submissions to the Senate inquiry, there was a call for submissions, there was public deliberation about this technology at numerous points. There was always a collection of, sorry, I just bumped my microphone, there was always a collection of submissions that were opposed to the technology on the grounds that an embryo is important and we shouldn't do anything more than we're already doing to them, or we shouldn't be doing it at all.
Yeah, I suppose it will vary country by country if the technology is adopted, because I mean in some countries, even in IVF cycles, you can't create more embryos than you can use, or that they think will grow to give you a good chance. So I expect it probably will vary. Great.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I don't think we've got any other questions. So thank you very much for the session, and great that, as I said, it's going to be recorded, will be available to people to catch up that perhaps have registered and couldn't come to attend today. So just to say thank you very much, and I'll just stop the recording now.
Thank you for having me.